Hello, it's time for another lecture, and this week we are talking about World War II, but we're not talking so much about the battles because you can just turn on the History channel for that. But we're talking about the war aims that the United States pursued in fighting in that war. Why did the United States fight in that war? Because they were the good guys and because they wanted to fight the good fight. You might have heard about that. And arguably, this is the war where this is definitely true without any reservations. But what was that fight? Franklin Roosevelt, in his For Freedom speech, which is not laying out a war program yet, because this is before Pearl Harbor, this is before the US officially joins in the fight against Hitler and the Axis powers, which included, of course, also Japan and Italy. But rather, this is in a world where World War II is already raging, Roosevelt positioning the United States in that increasingly dangerous international scene. Now, for a timeline, where we are when Roosevelt is giving the For Freedom speech. In Germany, democracy had ended in January of 1933, but it had ended by democratic means. Hitler's party actually lost some percentage points in elections in November of 1932 compared to an election in March of that year. But with the help of a nationalist, ultra-conservative party that had the backing of the agricultural barons of East Germany that had large estates with usually Polish agricultural labor, gave their votes to Hitler to become the Chancellor of Germany. And the moment that he became Chancellor, he moved quickly within a month or two to outlaw and jail the Communist Party and its leaders, to remove extra legally the members of parliament who had been elected as communists. That makes 15% of the vote. With that move, he had gained a majority, a clear majority in parliament. The Empowerment Act was passed, which established Hitler as a dictator, as a Führer, leader in English. And the remaining main opposition party, the Social Democrats, who had around 30% of the seats, was then outlawed along with labor unions. And then shortly after that, the remaining liberal democratic parties, as well as the Catholic Center Party, another democratic party with deep roots in Catholic regions in Germany. So by the end of the spring of 1933, one-party rule had been established, and mass persecution and wall-to-wall propaganda against liberals and Marxists and the damage they had done to Germany was reigning in Germany. So the first wave of victims of the regimes were members of labor unions, democratic politicians, etc., ethnic Germans. So if you think of the persecutions of Nazi Germany as primarily directed against Jews, gays, Sinti and Roma, who are often referred to as gypsies by their racial epithet, at first the regime was all about taking care of the enemies in the center and on the left, ethnic Germans. Many who could left the country. Some had already seen the signs and had done so before. Initially, internationally, there was lots of sympathy for this regime. And even as it was clear that Hitler's program was inherently about provoking war, expanding Germany by violent means at the expense of other nations, many still sympathized with his political goals, because after all, the view that the liberation of women that had taken place in the 1920s, the entry of Jews and women and ethnic minorities into the political realm or into the labor force was not popular with many conservatives. To take care of unions, to finally put the working class back in their place, was very popular with most business leaders. So Hitler had a lot of backers, and he could get away with a lot before finally the West went to war against Germany. In 1935, Hitler tore up international law by leaving the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations. And he begins rearming Germany to the teeth. In 1938, the regime institutes racial laws that define Jews as non-Germans. So even if you grew up in Germany and have German citizenship, if you are or had been, somebody in your family tree had been a Jew up to 3 generations back, you were losing your German citizenship, and you were also forbidden to intermarry with Gentiles, with non-Jews. These laws followed a template that the Nazis had found already in place in various locations. And there is some debate on who went first, but the Jim Crow American South had those kinds of miscegenation laws where you were not allowed to intermarry black and white. In Africa, however, where the Germans had set up settler colonies, notably Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, laws like that were also in effect, as well as in colonies in overseas established by the French and the British. So the racial laws had existed in the relations between black and white, both in the periphery, in the American South and in the colonies. When they were applied to the Jews, who you know, look like white people, if you will, they came home to roost, as it were. At least that is the argument of many anti-colonial writers after World War II. So the brutality of colonial regimes, the racism against Africans in particular, but also Latin Americans in the United States, is a precursor. It creates a society that is calling for its Hitler, to quote Aimé Césaire, a Frenchman who was a critic of both the colonial practice of the French as well as of fascism. And shortly after the purge of Jews from German public life, laws that made them once again outcasts in their own country, unable to hold most jobs by law, prevented from entering into contracts, say to rent a place or to buy property. They were essentially nobodies. They were left to their own devices. They were not yet deported and systematically murdered, as in the Holocaust. That happened 3 years later. So in 1938, the German regime also moved aggressively to expand militarily into neighboring countries. It annexed Austria and it annexed parts of Czechoslovakia, which was a democracy, multi-ethnic, pluralist, democratic country after the Western mold, formally protected by guarantees from France and Britain, and yet they sat by and did nothing. And in fact, they signed off on the land grab that the Nazis did on Czechoslovakia with the Munich Accord of 1938. The infamous scene where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to Britain, the conservative Prime Minister of Britain, returned to Britain waving a piece of paper saying, "I bring you peace in our time." Well, that time lasted for another year. And in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, not a democratic country at the time, nonetheless an ally of the West, so with the invasion of Poland, the British and the French once again had to ask themselves, will we honor our alliances? And once more, they formally declared war on Germany, but they sat on their hands until the Germans came to them in 1940 with the invasion of France, Norway, and the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. In 1941, after defeating France in a brief campaign, and we'll return to why that happened, the French military has got a bad reputation on account of this quick surrender to the Germans, but there is more to it. In 1941, Germany then invaded the Soviet Union. Up to that point, Stalin, the ruler of the Soviet Union, had had the Germans back. There had been an agreement in 1939 where the Soviet Union said, you take Western Poland and we take the East. Then in 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the Russians were surprised. In fact, the Germans passed on their way into the country trains loaded with export goods destined for Germany. So the Russians had no idea this was coming. The United States was sitting and watching this entire time. Meanwhile, in the East, or actually from the United States perspective, in the West, Japan, another country governed with a fascist philosophy, had invaded China and was doing horrible atrocities to the Chinese in the interest of gaining the province of Manchukuo, modern day. Oh, wait a minute! It's called Heilongjiang, I think, also known as Manchuria. Lots of mineral resources, coal, iron ore, and so forth that the Japanese didn't have but needed for their war machine. So here, the United States too had some interest, but were just standing on the sidelines watching, as were the British, who had colonies in India, right next door to where all this Japanese slaughter of the Chinese was happening. Roosevelt, in the For Freedom speech, is laying out a plan to support the British generously by providing them with weapons from American factories while not insisting on payment until after the war is done. And that really made a difference. It allowed the British to stand and fight, while in the United States, Roosevelt tried to build political support for being involved in the war. But it wasn't until 1941, when on December 7th, the Japanese attacked the American naval port of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, that the United States joined the war. The reactionary rewriting of the history of this country has produced some interesting flowers, like the claim that Roosevelt had, in fact, engineered, had colluded with the Japanese to make this attack happen. That's bogus. But it shows you to what lengths the right in this country goes to actually, in an Orwellian fashion, to rewrite the history to make its case. And why Roosevelt is a main target of this revision, of this propagandistic revision of history, the creation of an alternate timeline that never happened, but that nonetheless many people now believe, is of course because Roosevelt took a stance against fascism and all that it stood for. So what is this fascism, and how is what Roosevelt fights for not like it? How is it not like communism? What does it have to do with capitalism? This is what the For Freedom's speech shows us. In that field of fascism and communism and democracy, of socialism and capitalism, Roosevelt is picking a side. He's carving out a space that people were starting to doubt whether it was actually still there. A space that is defined by the simultaneous existence of democracy and capitalism. A political system that preserves the constitutional order that you have in the United States, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so forth, incorporating elements of social democracy, freedom from want, freedom from fear, the idea that you're also, you don't have to work yourself to the bone just to get by, but there is something in it for you. It has a material benefit for you. You have a say in the political system through democracy and freedom of speech, and yet capitalism is also preserved, a system where the most important parts of the economy are run for profit by private individuals, by a capitalist class. So this I will flesh out in the next part of